Shalom Aleichem, everyone. Welcome back to the Working Man's Kollel. We are in the 11th chapter of Masechah Shabbos. As we are making our way through the Masechta, we are almost halfway through the Masechta. Masechah Shabbos has 24 chapters, and even though we're not technically halfway through, we have one more chapter till we're halfway through. But this is really like the halfway point in terms of material that's discussed. The next chapter moves on to a completely new topic. Another one of the 39 malachos, the malacha of boneh, building, also discusses a number of different malachos, choresh and kotzer and kosev, writing, and it's really a lot of fun. Every Mishnah is fun, and every parak is fun, and we look forward to getting there, but we need to wrap up the first half of the Masechta, which by and large dealt with basically two halachos, if we can summarize them. The two halachos that were discussed, the two major themes were preparing for Shabbos, all of the halachos that go into what one needs to do to make sure they are not going to violate Shabbos on Shabbos. So there were institutions that were made by the rabbis prior to Shabbos in order to skirt some of the issues so they don't take place on Shabbos itself. And those were discussed in the end of the first chapter through the second chapter, which also had the halachos of lighting Shabbos candles, again, preparing for Shabbos. The third chapter, fourth chapter, all had to do with the laws of preparing food for Shabbos. And the beginning of the first chapter, and in addition to that, the fifth, sixth, a lot of the seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, and 11th chapter dealt heavily with the laws of carrying on Shabbos. Stuck in the middle in that 7th chapter, if you recall, we also dealt with some of the basic guiding principles to the malachos of Shabbos in general, which we will discuss in more detail when we get to the 12th chapter. But for today, I'd like to just wrap up the 11th chapter. We've spoken at length about the malacha of hotzah, and today actually we are not going to discuss specifically the malacha of hotzah. We've discussed it in length, and I hope that on Mondays you guys have the opportunity to get to the mishnayos we don't discuss in Shir on Wednesday, and because today I want to skip all the way to the last Mishnah in the parak. If you take a look at Mishnah Vav, the 6th Mishnah, which is on the screen right over here, the Mishnah says the following: Hazorik v'niskar la'achar sheyatsa miyada. Okay, so let's say the scenario is like this. The Mishnah says that let's say you throw something, which remember we learned in the beginning of the parak hazorik arba amos bekosel, that you zorik merishas hayachal or rishas harabim, that you violate the malacha of hotzah through throwing something, where you don't carry it from one domain to the next, but rather you throw it from one domain to the next. Okay, so we said that carries a level of prohibition. The discussion we had was about, if you're throwing above a certain level of airspace, is that still going to be a prohibition or not a prohibition? Okay, but regardless, let's assume all else is equal, but you are simply just getting from point A to point B through the means of throwing something. That is a tolda. That's a subset of hotzah, and therefore it would carry with it the same level of prohibition. It would be it would come with a liability to, if God forbid someone gave you warning and then you said, I'm aware of the issue of doing this and I'm going to do it anyway, that it would result in the death penalty. But usually if it's done through a shogeg, where you're not completely aware of the prohibition that you are violating, rather just what you're doing. I know that I'm moving something from one domain to the other, but I either forgot that today is Shabbos, or I forgot that doing this on Shabbos is prohibited. So then it still carries a prohibition. It still carries a consequence of having to bring a sin offering to the Beis HaMikdash. So By throwing something, it has that same status as if you were to carry it from one domain to the other. But now the Mishnah discusses a very unique scenario where I threw something, v'niskar la'achar sheyatza miyado, and then I remembered after it left my hand. What does it mean, I remembered after it left my hand? I remembered that I threw it. I remember that I was playing catch. What does it mean that I remember? So what the Mishnah is referring to over here is a very, very important halacha that is going to be discussed more explicitly at the end of the Mishnah, but it's referring to the halacha of how to define shogeg. In order to violate Shabbos, you could violate Shabbos in one of two ways: either b'mezid, on purpose, or by, we'll call it accident, where I did not purposefully violate Shabbos. I purposefully did this action, but I didn't purposefully violate Shabbos. Now, in order for me to, not, know that this was prohibited, or I didn't mean to violate Shabbos, it has to be that I didn't know that this was a prohibited action to do, right? I either didn't know it was Shabbos, or I didn't know that this particular action was prohibited. And only in that scenario will I be obligated to then bring a carbon to the Beis HaMikdash. But let's say I did know, okay? I knew very well that this is prohibited, and I did it anyway. That's not called shogeg, that's called mazid. If it's mazid, if it's done on purpose, you don't bring a carbon in that scenario. In that scenario, then you would be given the punishment of kares, that you would be spiritually excommunicated from God for doing such a thing. But it's a completely different consequence, a more severe consequence, but a completely different consequence. If someone violates Shabbos by mazid, doing it on purpose, they can't bring a carbon to the Beis HaMikdash at all. They number one, wouldn't be obligated to, and number two, they wouldn't have the right to. Bringing such a carbon to the Beis HaMikdash would be what we call chulin ba'azara, bringing something unconsecrated to the temple, because it was never obligated for you to bring this carbon. You would not be allowed to bring this carbon at all. This sacrifice is not allowed to be brought and burnt on the altar. So the Mishnah here now is discussing, well, how do we define something being outside of your awareness so that you would be obligated to bring a carbon? So the Mishnah tells us that part of that is you need to have the requisite knowledge of what you're doing the entire way through. Meaning, if I knew the whole time that I was violating Shabbos, then you, by definition, obviously can't call that shogeg. And if you didn't know the whole time you were doing it, that you were violating Shabbos, so then by definition, we're going to call that shogeg. We're going to call that you did it, quote unquote, by accident. You didn't realize you were doing it. But what if it was half and half? Let's say I, when I started doing it, I did not realize that I was violating Shabbos. Then halfway through, the ball is flying in the air, and while it is, making, reaching the point of its crescent, making it down onto the outside field that I'm throwing it to, I realize, oh my gosh, today's Shabbos. It's not Sunday. So in that scenario, what would we call that? Is it shogeg? Well, at some point I did realize what I did. And you can't really call it mazid because I started out not realizing what I was doing. So do I bring a carbon or not? So take a look what the Mishnah says. Hazorik v'niska la'achar sheyatz miyado. Let's say I only realized after it left my hand. Katla achar, katla kelev, or nisrfa. And or if someone else caught it, or if it was caught by a dog, or if it was burnt up, so then I am pater. I'm not obligated to bring a carbon at all. Completely pater from having to bring a carbon, because the Mishnah is going to say later that because I never fully engaged in this lapse of knowledge. There was a moment in time where I actually did realize what I was doing. So therefore, by definition, I can't bring a carbon for that. Zarak la'atzos chabura. let's say I throw something in order to hurt someone. Okay, so I take the ball, and not just to throw it out onto a field, but I throw it into my brother is walking down the street, and I take the ball and I whack him in the head with it, right? So in such a scenario, what?
What's the significance of adding in that the ball was caught by somebody or a dog?
These would be other scenarios. These would be other scenarios where you did not perform the entire malacha.
But isn't it enough just to say, aren't they trying to make the point by saying that after it left his arm, that's when he remembered? So either way, it would have been an avera, right? Either way, it would have been prohibited, whether it was
certainly it's prohibited to do. The question is whether or not you have to bring a carbon. So the Mishnah just listed a bunch of examples where you wouldn't have to bring a carbon in that scenario.
But why? But regardless of
all of those, the common denominator between all of them are scenarios where the end of the action, and this is something we're going to get to, which is how do we treat a malacha where it has a lapse of time in between from when the malacha started until the malacha ended, right? In each of those scenarios, the malacha never got to be completed in that mazed form. Either because there was something artificial that prevented it from happening, or it's because your knowledge of the scenario changed, right? So in such a scenario, you never have to bring a carbon. So and that's the common denominator between all of these cases.
Okay.
Zarak la'asos chabura, I throw it in order to hurt someone. Bein ba'adam, bein b'behema, whether I did it to hurt a person or to hurt an animal. V'niskar ad shelo nasa chabura pater. And let's say I only remember once the before the chabura was created, so then on pater I would be pater again, because the if I do something to hurt someone on Shabbos, that is not going to be liable on Shabbos. That is not usher to do from Hilchos Shabbos perspective, because it's simply just to hurt someone. So in that scenario, even though I only realized afterwards that I was doing it in order to make a chabura, once it already started, still that's enough in order to prevent me from having to bring a carbon.
This is just saying that you're not obligated, you're not chayav for being mechalal Shabbos, but you still would be obligated for damages, wouldn't you?
Of course, yes. Yeah. This is only talking about Hilchos Shabbos, certainly. With regard to having to pay Shevet, Sar, Ripui, Boshes, and Nezek, all of the damage payments that one would have to make, certainly you're 100% right. What we're talking about is only Hilchos Shabbos right now. Now the Mishnah gets to Zeh HaKlal. Here's the guiding principle. Kol chayvei chatos, and this is what we're going to spend time on now. Yeah.
A question. So if he had thrown it intentionally with, like knowing that it was Shabbos, that he would also be patur, but it would be patur for Nezikin and Chaya for Skila, right?
If he did it, you're saying because of Kim
Levid Ramene.
Yeah. It's a whole sugya in Ksubas on Daf Lamed Gimel, yeah. So here comes the Mishnah now. Zeh HaKlal. Here's the guiding principle. Kol chayvei chatos enon chayavin ad shitehet chilason v'sofon shkaga. The principle is like this, that with regard to anything that you'd be chayav a chatos for, not just Hilchos Shabbos, but any halacha you'd be obligated to bring a chatos for, enon chayavin, the only time you're going to be chayav is ad shetihet chilason v'sofan shkaga, that the beginning and end of your act all needs to be in the same frame of mind, which is either I don't know it's Shabbos, or I didn't know this was prohibited, or whatever it is, that it needs to be the entire length of time that it takes you to violate the prohibition needs to be with that same frame of mind. However, continues the Mishnah, Tchilasan shkaga v'sofan zadon. However, if the beginning of your action takes place bishkaga, in that ignorant place, v'sofan zadon, and the end turns out that you wanted it to happen on purpose, or v'tchilasan zadon v'sofan shkaga, or let's say I started with it, I wanted it to happen purposefully, and then later it turned into, for whatever reason, I had a lapse, a memory lapse thing, not realizing that what I was actually doing was a violation of Shabbos. Let's say, for example, I really want to violate Shabbos this week. Like I'm yearning for it. I got to violate Shabbos this week. So what do? I go outside to my front lawn, and I take a big shovel and I dig a big hole in my ground in front of my house on Shabbos. That is D'Oraisa, huge violation of Shabbos. That is Isser D'Oraisa, 100%. That is certainly a violation of Shabbos. But let's say I stick the thing in the ground to go dig up the dirt, and I realize as I'm doing it, oh wait, hold on one second. Is digging dirt a violation of Shabbos? Or maybe it's not. And I actually don't realize that it is. I for some reason change my mind in my thinking and think, oh wait, maybe this action isn't actually a violation of Shabbos. In such a scenario, so then there is no chatas that would need to be brought, even though one might be able to call that shogeg. Still, there's no chatas brought. Peturin. It needs to be that you do it in this unintentional or coming from an ignorant place the entire way through the malacha for you to have to bring a carbon. Now, this doesn't mean that it's better. Bringing a carbon is the lowest level of means it was the lowest level of violation. Not being able to bring a carbon is not a good thing. That's a bad thing. One would much rather violate Shabbos with the result of having to bring a carbon than, God forbid, the result of having to of receiving kares, or God forbid worse, skila. It would be a bad thing not to bring a carbon. So when we say that oh, you're putter, that has a very positive connotation to it, but it's actually quite negative in that you don't have the right now to bring a carbon. So what I want to spend a little bit of time on are basically two very important things that come out of this Mishnah. Number one is we're going to take a step back to look at a machlokas that I'm not sure if we ever addressed together as a shir, but it's a very important machlokas with regard to the malachos of Shabbos. There's a machlokas between, let me pull it up. Let me see if I can get it on the screen. Okay, it's not coming up on the screen. There's a machlokas. Between the Rashash and the Minchas Chinuch with regard to really how you define malachos in general. But it's patterned around it's built around two malachos, and both malachos have a lapse of time associated with them. One is planting, and one is cooking. Okay, so comes the Rashash and tells us that even though the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah on Daf Yud Gimel teaches that if someone takes a seed and puts it in the ground, there's all machlokas in the Mishnah how long it takes for the seed to take root. Either it takes 3 days, or it takes 30 days, or it takes 13 days. It's a whole discussion how long the seed takes for it to take root. Now, it seems like a ridiculous machlokas because it's not something that rabbis should be arguing about. It's something that botanists should be arguing about, or agricultural scientists should be arguing about. This is not a question that is up to rabbis. Which is why the way you have to interpret a machlokas, whenever you get to a machlokas like that, a machlokas in the tzius, which is about facts. So everyone knows when, the seed starts to, sprout its roots. But the question is, how much of the seed sprouting its roots is enough for you to, for us to call that having taken root? So that becomes a halachic question. That in a halacha, we all know how long it takes. We all, it doesn't really matter, what we think. The doctors or the scientists told us this is what happens. The professionals told us that this is what happens. But the question is that at this stage in the planting process, is that enough of it to take root in order for you to be considered liable? Anyway, so the Rashash says, but regardless of that, on Shabbos, if I were to take a seed and put it in the ground, that is a violation of the malacha of Zoreah. I'm sorry, not the Rashash, the Mincha Sinuch. The Rashash argues. The Mincha Sinuch says if I take a seed and I put it in the ground, that's a prohibition of the malacha of Zoreah on Shabbos. The Rashash says no. The Rashash says that it needs to take root. Okay? That basically I put the seed in the ground on Shabbos. It's going to take a number of days for it to take root, for it to have hashrasha. So says the Rashash that let's say on Wednesday or Thursday, it's going to take root. So the Rashash says retroactively you are going to have violated Shabbos. Okay? Minchas Chinuch says no. When I put a seed in the ground, that is a violation of Shabbos. The Minchas Chinuch says that this is the exception to the rule. The rule is that malachos in general, we look at the result. That once the result happens, then you violate Shabbos. If no result takes place on Shabbos, you're not going to violate Shabbos. He gives an example, the Minchas Chinuch. The Minchas Chinuch's example of Rav Yosef Babat. He wrote one of the most amazing Sfarim in Lumdis as a commentary to the Sefer HaChinuch. He was the Av Bezin of Chernobyl. The Minchas Chinuch says that, let's say, with regard to cooking or baking, okay. So when I put something in the oven, so it takes, it doesn't cook immediately. It takes some time for it to cook and become edible, right? We spoke about when we did the third parak about Michael ben Dersai, that in order for you to violate Shabbos, it needs to cook. If it's past the level of it being cooked up to Michael ben Dersai, where it's at least edible, even though someone might even consider that to be quote unquote raw or extremely rare. But even to get to that point, it takes time, right? You don't just immediately throw something on the grill and it's cooked, or you throw something in the oven and it's cooked, or you try and throw challahs in the oven. It takes 10, 15 minutes for it to get cooked up. So the Minchas Chinuch says that if, let's say, a second before Shabbos is over, I take a challah and I put it in the oven, okay, or I take a batch of cookies and I put it in the oven, and now they're not going to bake until after Shabbos is over, says the Minchas Chinuch, so I have not violated Shabbos. I did not violate Shabbos. But Zoreah is an exception to the rule, he says. Because even though the hashrash is not going to take place till later, but he feels as though just simply putting the seed in the ground is going to be a violation of Shabbos. But the Rashash says no, it needs to take root. If it doesn't take root, so then you're not going to violate Shabbos. Comes along a sefer called the Shvisas HaShabbos. The Shvisas HaShabbos is a sefer that was written in the 50s. It's a sefer on Hilchos Shabbos, on the 39 malachos. He only covers about 13 of the 39 malachos. But he has beautiful divrei Torah there, and he was a student of Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank. So a lot of our psukim from Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank with regard to Shabbos come from the sefer Shvisas HaShabbos. Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank was the Rabbi Shel Yerushalayim. He was one of the first chief rabbis of Yerushalayim in the modern state of Israel. And he was an unbelievable Talmid Chacham, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank. So Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, from the Shvisas HaShabbos, asks a question on the Rashash. Hold on one second. If I put a seed in the ground and it's going to take it a number of days for it to take root, take 3 days, take a week, it could take 2 weeks, it could take a long time. Okay, It takes a long time for it to take root. So hold on one second. When I put the seed in the ground, I did it b'shogeg. Okay? Let's assume that we're talking about shogeg over here. We're talking about whether or not I'm going to bring a carbon. Says the Rashash, you're not obligated to bring a carbon unless it takes root. Okay? Says Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, he says, hold on. What did our Mishnah say? I'm not going to be obligated to bring a carbon for having violated Shabbos unless my action from the beginning to the end was all done b'shogeg. It was all done in this, from this ignorant type of place. There's no such thing as shogeg when it's not Shabbos. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Sunday. These days don't have the concept of shogeg and mazid associated with them with regard to Shabbos. He points to a Rashi. It's a fundamental Rashi in Sanhedrin on Taf Samach Vav. The Rashi says that you can only violate Shabbos if the malacha takes place on Shabbos. Associated with the malacha is also the intention behind the malacha. The malacha and the intention behind the malacha can only take place on Shabbos. Outside the realm of Shabbos, it doesn't matter. Like what the Minchas Chinuch says, that if you put the cake in the oven 2 minutes before Shabbos is over and it's going to bake afterwards, so then the reason you're not going to be liable for that is because it baked after Shabbos. The malacha only took place after Shabbos, not on Shabbos. So when's the malacha taking place here? After Shabbos. It's not taking place on Shabbos. And what did our Mishnah just tell us? The entire malacha needs to, from the beginning of the end, to be in the same mindset, the same intention, and that has to take place on Shabbos. So why in the world would the Minchas Chinuch say that if I put a seed in the ground on Shabbos, I'm not going to be liable until it takes root? It's a bomb question, right? That is a very, very difficult question on the Rashash. A very difficult question. He points to another Mishnah. There's another Mishnah in the second chapter of Maseches Trumos that the Mishnah discusses how if, let's say, someone puts a seed in the ground and they leave it there. The Mishnah says that once the seed is in the ground, they could just leave it there. They don't need to pull it up, even if it's going to cause a prohibition. Here, the Mishnah says the following. It says, I'll find the Mishnah, but the Mishnah basically says that once it's there, you could just leave it and keep it there. But says Rabbi Frank again, why would you leave it there? You should rip it up before you violate Shabbos, according to the Rashash. So the Rashash is very difficult to understand. Rabbi Frank's answer is based on a Nemuke Yosef, and I think we discussed this Nemuke Yosef in another context. The Nemuke Yosef has a problem with lighting Shabbos candles. He says because the Gemara in Bava Kama on Daf Chaf Beis says that Isho Mishum Chetzio, that we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan, that when I light a fire, if I strike a match and light a fire and cause arson, so then we associate all of the damage that is going to take place that we view as if it's happening right now. So says the Muke Joe, says the Muke Yosef, he says, so hold on one second. It's going to be the same issue with lighting Shabbos candles. If I light Shabbos candles before Shabbos, then we associate all future burning that's going to take place, that it's associated with me. So then if that's the case, so then I'm going to be lighting a candle on Shabbos. So Nukei Yosef answers and he says that no, it's not that you're continuously lighting the arson. It's not that you're continuously causing more damage, but all damage that's going to happen, it's associated with as if you did it right now. So it says the Nukei Yosef, it's the same thing for Shabbos candles. We view as if the entire lamp of the Shabbos candles, all the oil, all the wax, burnt down already now before Shabbos. Conceptually, that's the way we view it. So it says Frank, that's how we can answer for the Rashash also. The Rashash said that if you put a seed in the ground, you're going to violate Shabbos when it takes root in a bunch of days from now. Came along Rabbi Frank to ask a question from our Mishnah, that our Mishnah says that you need to be in dealing with the malacha needs to take place completely on Shabbos in the same intention. Comes along and the Rabbi Frank to answer his own question by saying, no, if you look at the Nukei Yosef gave us a principle that if it's going to take a long time for the malacha to happen, we retroactively put it back on your original action. And since the original action took place on Shabbos, and that original action was mitchilasan v'ad sofan, the shogeg, from the beginning to the end, was all with shogeg, so then in such a scenario, you would be obligated to bring a carbon. Okay, that's one important thing we learned from this Mishnah, and how we paskin between the machlokes, between the Rashash and the Minchas Chinuch. I just want to get to that now in terms of how we paskin. So this seems to be a machlokes in the poskim for sure. It happens to be that this is a machlokes between a Rebbe and a Talmud of how we paskin. The Avnei Nezer, who we've discussed in the past, Rav Avram Bornstein, he was the Sakachava Rebbe. Was born in 1833. He passed away in 1910. The Sakachava Rebbe was, as Rav Soloveitchik put it, a super genius. He wrote a sefer on Shabbos. That's probably one of the most fundamental svarim that were written in the modern era since the Shulchan Aruch, titled the Eglei Tal on the laws of Shabbos, is one of the most unbelievable svarim, the genius of the Avnei Nezer, of the Sakachava Rebbe. His Talmud was the Chelkas Yoav. There's a machlokes between the Chelkas Yoav and the Avnei Nezer, how we paskin. The Avnei Nezer thought that we paskin like the Minchas Chinuch, that from the moment you put the seed in the ground, you violate Shabbos. However, the Chelkas Yoav paskins like the Rashash, and this really is a fundamental machlokes, as we mentioned. It's a fundamental machlokes about how we view the malachos of Shabbos in general, as being that we look at the malachos of Shabbos that it matters about the action or it matters about the result. And Rav Soloveitchik like to say that it really matters about both, and both need to take place on Shabbos. And according to the Rashash, it is possible to retroactively associate a result back to an action. Okay, Hadron Alaf Perak Azorek. We'll return to the 11th chapter of Masechah Shabbos next week. We start with part B of Masechah Shabbos, the Parak of Habona, getting into the details of the rest of the 39 malachos. And just a heads up for what's ahead. We're going to be dealing with the malachos of Shabbos for the next about 3 chapters. 4 chapters. And then we're going to be moving into some of the rabbinic institutions on Shabbos. Then the end of the Masechta deals with the laws of refuah on Shabbos. But we'll get to there when we get there. All right, we'll stop here for now. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to hang on for a little bit.